So, just in case you weren't able to check on our event page, this panel is rated orange. We are the lowest level of explicit material for this convention. That means there will be no direct nudity or sexual themes in this panel. There's plenty of other visual novel themed not safe for work panels that you can go to at the convention. I recommend checking out our event. We're no nudity here, guys. um, Yes, I recommend checking out some of the other visual novel themed panels being presented today and tomorrow that have a little bit more of a spicy theme to them. So, just to get quickly started on how this presentation is going to go, we're going to be talking about why visual novels are made, sort of a brief dive into the history of visual novels and what they mean in the context of the video game scene, and how you sort of go about making one as specifically an independent developer. I'm not going to be going into details about industry ways to make visual novels or anything like that because I don't have any experience with that. I am just a single guy making a little visual novel for fun. And next, we're going to dive a bit into like the specifics of how visual novels are made, and my experiences making my visual novel on very much a time crunch. And lastly, if we have time, we'll do a quick demo of the visual novel. We'll probably have some time at the end for Q&A in case anybody wants to leave their questions towards the end. I don't anticipate this panel lasting the full hour, so hopefully we can get out a little bit early, just like a class, am I right? So firstly, who am I to be making this presentation? Like I said earlier, my name is Talon. Go by Twinkletalon, at Twinkletalon on all the social media. I am primarily a fan artist who makes a lot of fan art and some games. This game right here, Mistletoe for the Christmas Messenger, is what we're going to be focusing on today, and it's the visual novel that I've made. However, I've also made this fun little game called Dear Departure, which was my senior thesis in college as my final project as an art major. My professors really griped on me for that one, making a video game instead of, some paintings. So, to kind of dive deep into what Mistletoe for the Christmas Messenger is, it was made for a shipping Olympics earlier this year around the holidays. And it was made by me and my teammates from Team Letters Painted in Red. That would include me, Talon, making all of the sprite art and the CGs, Leah, the scriptwriter, programmer, and the most experienced developer of us all. They've made a few other fan-made games, and they really guided us along the process. And finally, Jihye, who was our beta reader, our playtester, and really the artistic mind behind really letting us explore Edvik. This game is a BL fan-made visual novel for the mobile game Identity 5. And it was around the holidays when we made this, so we really wanted to make it a holiday-themed video game. And these two characters coincidentally had some holiday-themed skins. So we decided to focus on that as our theme. And no worries if you have no idea what this video game is. It doesn't play a big part into the nature of this panel. However, it does help in understanding these two little boys over here. Yes, we will be talking about Ren'Py later. There we go. So, oh no, zoom, why? So, the process of making a game, this isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule, but I basically boil down the process of conceiving the ideas behind the game, really deciding on your scope that you want to explore, actually making the game, and then lastly, reflecting on what you did and what you'd like to do to improve in the future, because reflection is always important when you want to explore bigger projects like making video games. Firstly, we're going to talk about what makes visual novels so appealing in comparison to other genres of games, especially for solo developers. Visual novels, as you can kind of tell by the name, are just basically novels that you have to click through. Books and stories are really immersive and enticing to people to explore new fictional worlds and to explore particular themes like romance and drama. And a lot of people love to explore those themes through interactive media like video games. However, what also makes visual novels so interesting and sort of like inclusive for everybody is that there's no skill barrier when it comes to visual novels. A few other games that have the good story, they have the good writing, and they're really well made, but they have a skill barrier that can stop many people from being able to interact with them personally. My go-to example is Elden Ring. I love the concept of Elden Ring. I'd love to understand the lore that's going on in there. Would I ever play Elden Ring? Probably not. I'm not that good of a gamer, guys. I'm a fake gamer. I'm not very good at skill-based video games. And that's why I really gravitated towards visual novels because of that lack of barrier in terms of the time investment that you have to make in order to get good at the button mashes and to know an enemy's attack patterns and stuff. And lastly, visual novels are as they have as much variety as you can give to them because there's really no limitation on the type of story that you can tell with a visual novel. And again, really, like the limit is your imagination, guys. It's just a lot of prose and a lot of reading. And so, like books, there's only the limitation of what you can come up with to be the topic for this game. And kind of to lead into that, why would you not make another genre of game? Honestly, as somebody who has had to code in Unity before, different types of video games are significantly harder to make than visual novels. Dear Departure, which was the other video game on my introduction slide, was coded entirely in Unity, and although it is technically a visual novel because you are talking with people and interacting with characters, having to code all of that on my own is still significantly more challenging than utilizing the pre-established framework that a lot of visual novel engines have. And along that same vein, it means that lower barrier to entry isn't just for the player. That lower barrier is also present for the developer of the game. It's significantly easier to get visual novels up and running. I distinctly have used RenPy to get prototypes of video games up and running within a few hours. It's very easy to pick up visual novel writing without having any previous coding experience. Although coding experience is very helpful when making video games, visual novels are one of the key genres of video games that coding isn't the primary factor when it comes to how immersive you want your visual novel to be. And that does mean that visual novels are a lot more appealing to the artists and writers among us than the programmers. That's not to say that if you love programming that you can't make a really good visual novel. Visual novels do benefit from good programming in ways that can become a lot more interesting because they're not as visible to a player. So, in other video games where there is more interactivity and movement and sort of combat, you could say, programming is a lot more obvious in terms of getting that up and running. But good programming visual novels, guys, is really, really important. You want streamlined code. It's great. Have I ever used RPG Maker MZ? MZ is a really good place to start. We're going to talk about that later when we talk about engines, but I have not used MZ. God, what's the version I used? I've prototyped in XE? No. It was a long time ago. I've used primarily Unity and RenPy. And the game that I helped create for this example of the panel was made using Tyranno Builder. But I do recommend MZ. Well, I'll get into more of the specifics of why later. So this is not really a informational panel. However, I did want to talk about the history of visual novels to kind of give a background in case people aren't really aware of the history of the genre. Visual novels as a concept started primarily in Japan as an offshoot of the umbrella term of adventure game. Adventure games are kind of typically what you think of when you think of American point and click games, where you're walking around a two-dimensional scene and you're clicking on specific objects to interact with them and to further progress a plot. Oh God, yeah, Japan. So see, Japan markets adventure games like visual novels because in Japan there's not as much of a distinction between the two of them because visual novel as a term kind of encompasses adventure games. It's kind of like calling a square a rectangle, you know? Like there are differences. And let's be real, I'm not the expert on this topic. But if you love point and click and you love visual novels, then I highly recommend looking into the genre of adventure games. And in the early days, in kind of like the 80s, these games were primarily text-based, as can be seen with what is called the first visual novel, The Portopia Serial Murder Case by Enix, which I didn't know this. Enix is the precursor to Square Enix. So if you ever look at a Square game and be like, hey, do they make visual novels? They did at one point in time. And although visual novels do have that kind of association with anime-styled games and Japanese influences, that is not entirely the case, although visual novels might adopt that anime aesthetic very often. There's no direct link between that, and many other countries over time have, of course, branched out and made their own niche genre of visual novels. Really, as with as much difference there is between visual novels and adventure games and all these other micro genres, the main concept that all of them adhere to is that there usually has to be multiple endings. That was one of the main things that made visual novels so unique in these early days of video game development, was that there was a plot and there were multiple endings that you could reach within that plot. It was a very important functional idea to have this novel that you could choose the ending of. And that was what was really appealing to early visual novel developers. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what making your visual novel encompasses. So first, you got to decide on your concept. What do you want to do? I said earlier that the only limit was your imagination, and I do mean that genuinely because visual novels are only going to be what you make of them. You really have to decide what genre you want to work in. You can always go for common examples like romance, murder mystery, or resource management, and there's nothing wrong with that. Those games are staples for a reason. When you think of visual novels, you usually think of dating sims, you think of romance. And that's so appealing for people because of those multiple endings, because you're able to go back and replay those games and have a different experience each and every time you play it. However, there's nothing stopping you from wanting to break away from conventional tropes and to think outside of the box when it comes to visual novels. My sort of recommendation when it comes to thinking of your concept is really going broad first and then narrowing in on what you want to do. Because starting out vague first will allow you to explore different ideas as you go through the development process, and it'll allow you to explore what you're most interested in the process of making your video game. Exactly, you want to turn fan fiction into visual novels. Honestly, that is not done enough. I constantly advocate for people to literally just turn their fan fiction into visual novels. It's not easy. I was gonna say it's easy. It's not too easy, but it is when you have a pre-established story, that's like half the battle right there. Knowing what you want to do and already having the plot written out already, that's half the work you've got right there done. Yeah, it really lets you flesh out specific scenes. The Kaiba and Joey Fiends, so good. So good. Also apologize if you can hear a dog barking in the background. A few people mentioned this earlier, but one of the primary ways to start exploring video games is through game jams. Um, Game jams, like a few people mentioned earlier, are basically just timed events or competitions where people make who make video games and do it on a time crunch, really. It's very admirable what people can do in such a small amount of time. Some game jams are only a weekend. Some jams are a few months, a few weeks. I haven't seen one go for a year, but I bet they do exist. And the benefit of choosing a game jam is that oftentimes jams will have a predetermined theme or concept that you don't have to pick. So it takes away some of the mental load on your end trying to figure out what you want to do. Instead, you want to appeal to the ideas present in this game jam. I just wanted to shout out a few popular examples that we've got going on this year. Um, Specifically the GMTK game jam, which I was so mad. GMTK literally ended this week, guys. It ended this week, and they'll probably post all of their stuff on YouTube within a few weeks, where you can see a lot of examples of what people can do on time crunches. And I highly recommend it. It's one of the most popular game jams present. And next, we've got Scream Jam. Someone else mentioned a Spooktober Jam earlier in the call, so now we've got two Halloween-themed game jams starting up in October that you can join. We love some spooky themes. And lastly, I wanted to shout out the Kenny Jam, which is not visual novel themed. I will preface. Kenny is a video game developer and asset developer who makes a lot of pre-made assets for video games. And basically the idea of the Kenny Jam is that you have to use the assets that are Kenny, like you have to use his assets. So it's very fun because you don't have to make any of your own assets. Oh, let's see. Spooktober starts in September. We got to get that going. See, you have to the game has to be ready by Halloween. That's the thing. The AO3 Doom. I've played Doom on AO3. Guys, if you like coding, AO3 is also a great option. You can literally play Doom on AO3. Oh, people are talking in the chat. Nice. Yes, you can play Doom on AO3. HTML is your friend if you love to code. If you love web development, AO3 is your best friend. And there's not a lot of places to explore that on the internet nowadays, so I highly recommend that. And just a quick final detour before we get into the specifics of making your game is I wanted to shout out fan games, which we've already kind of mentioned in the chat. A lot of what makes fandoms passionate about video game development is through making fan games. And there have been some prolific ones recently, like Pokemon Uranium and Undertale Yellow, that have really fleshed out what is possible with not even just independent development, but unpaid like volunteer development from fans, by fans, for fans. And these games are great because one, you don't have to come up with any OCs. You don't have to come up with their names or a setting. You know, all of that is pre-made for you. Unless you're doing an AU, in which case it's more like a fan fiction. um, but oh no, don't do that to me, Google Slides. Yes, fan games are great. We all love them. I can tell by how much people are talking about it in the chat. Oh, another shout out, the only one of any asset jams. Yes, asset jams are probably going to be your best bet when it comes to not having to make your own art. I understand that not everybody's an artist. I specifically come from the art side of VN development, but if you're not an artist, but you still want to make a visual novel, then pre-made assets are the way to go. Can you start working on the game before the jam actually starts? Depends. Most of the time, I would say no. Because basically, the idea of the time limit of a game jam is that they want you to only be coding in your engine within that time frame. But you can still think, they usually reveal the theme a little while before the jam actually starts, so that you can play around with ideas in your head to get a jump start on that. But they want the actual work to be done within the time frame that they've allotted, if that makes sense. Yes. So another benefit of fan games is that, good, I'm glad you understand. The benefit of a fan game includes the fact that you already have a pre-established fandom to work with when it comes to an audience for your game. One of the main hurdles that a lot of developers come across when making their own fan games is that you have to build a pre-established audience to love your game. So fan games kind of divert that problem immediately by having a fandom already willing and able to interact with your game. However, something we'll vaguely touch on later is you cannot monetize a fan game. I'm just gonna flat out say, don't do it. If you're looking here for fan game stuff, no money should be involved. At least if you're in the early stages of VN development. We're all doing this as a passion project, guys. We do this for the love of the art, for the trying to be philosophical here. Anyway, just I would highly recommend not monetizing a fan game. Now, we got to talk about how big your game is going to be. It's very illegal. This is jumping into legal territory. I am not legal counsel. If you monetize a fan game, you're gonna get taken out back by Nintendo, guys. Just don't do it. Pokemon Uranium, they're on iffy water. Yes, back on topic. How big will your game be? If this is your first time making a visual novel, I recommend making it super small, itty bitty, microscopic, if you can even read the text I put on that slide. We really want to keep the scope of what you want to do in line because feature creep is a thing. It's not as much of a thing with visual novels, but feature creep can really like extend the amount of time that you have developing a game because you always want to make the game the best that it can be, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, the more things that you keep on adding to your visual novel, the more things that you have to code, that you have to write, that you have to make art for. And it's really exponential in terms of, especially if we're talking about like multiple branching story beats in like a highly complex visual novel, making more and more endings and making more and more assets is only going to delay the inevitable of getting your game published. So I highly recommend keeping your first foray into visual novels a very short romp. If you want this to be a nice stroll in the park, we don't need an epic saga adventure for your first game. And I honestly don't even recommend making more than like 3 endings for your first visual novel. The one that we made in a week, it's got one ending, guys. There's like a few choices that impact like 2 dialogue options, but really you're gonna want to go the route that like Telltale games goes, where you make a choice, they kind of diverge a little bit, but then they come back to meet before the end of the story. I should have added a Telltale diagram to this slide. That would have been nice. But if you get what I mean, BioWare choices, yeah, that's why the big industry developers don't actually make choices that impact the story because they know and they have the experience that if you make actual impactful choices in your video game, then that triples the workload that you have to do to get it published. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. If you're willing to spend the time and possibly the money to get that done, then I really admire you. However, in terms of getting your first video game published, we want this to be short and sweet. I highly recommend exactly. Riley, you mentioned a game that takes 30 minutes to play. That's a perfectly good amount of time to play a game. I wrote 3 hours long on the slide, but I honestly wouldn't even go over like 1.5. Like 5,000 words, if we're talking in fan fiction terms, of what you want your game to be. Um, yeah, and especially if you're not a writer by trade, like if you're coming in this from the programming or the art side, I would highly recommend keeping the actual text of your visual novel short. Short and sweet. That's what we're going for. Next, we're going to be talking about who you are making your visual novel with. Oh, wait, I got a question. Do you recommend making it small at the beginning and then later on building to it, like adding more things later? A lot of visual novels will do this. I've seen this a lot with Kickstarter backed visual novels, actually, where you have a core set of routes or you have a core set of love interests, and then later on more are added. This can be a good thing if you're viewing it like DLC, because you want the main game to be complete on its own, but you also want it to be you want it to be like expansive enough that you can add on to it later without making it feel like it's tacked on. So it's a delicate road to follow. If this is your first game, I'd recommend making it all in one go and getting it done. But if you have more experience and you're able to, like if you have a lore master and you're really good at keeping all of your routes and all your characters interconnected really well, then you can go for it. But as a beginner, I probably wouldn't recommend it just because again, that scope creep. Really it's called creep for a reason. It really creeps on you, you know. But one way to help with that scope creep and to keep yourself in check is to work on your visual novel with somebody else. I mentioned this earlier, but writers, programmers, and artists are sort of the primary roles that you're going to be getting when talking about visual novels. But if you're not a jack of all trades, then getting on this level can be a bit more intimidating because especially if you're like not at all versed in one of these three areas, then getting someone else to help can really lighten the workload in terms of what you want to do and how well you want it done. The only problem is that you have to anticipate not having 100% creative control over what you do. See, music is another good example. I didn't even think about music when I was making this slide, but music is also a very integral part to visual novels. Hmm. Yeah, tragic. I'm reading your comment. Yeah, that is a good mindset, I would say generally. I mean, hey, chaotic. A lot of people look for artists because, in my experience, writers are the most common when it comes to visual novels, and people really love having programmers and artists work with them. Um, and another way to have more people work on your project is to also do commissions. This can get very expensive very fast, and especially if you're talking about fan games here, commission work is probably not the route you want to go unless you've got money to spend. But it is something we can talk about later if people have any questions about it. But at the end of the day, you can also work alone. The solo dev dream is real, even if it's very difficult. Now, time to pick a game engine. So here's some examples of engines that I have not, if not experience with, have had time looking over and researching. We've got RenPy, Tyranna Builder, Twine, all of the versions of RPG Maker. We're clumping them together, Game Maker Studio, and Unity. Now, we're not going to go in depth on all of these engines, and if you have any other recommendations, then you can throw them in the chat. These are just the ones that I picked out as being either the most beginner friendly or the cheapest. So we're going to highlight RenPy, Twine, RPG Maker, and Game Maker Studio in this presentation. First, we're going to talk about RenPy. Some people mentioned this earlier. You love visual novels, you love RenPy. It is free to use, free to love, and it has plenty of people ready and willing to help you make your dream a reality with RenPy. When I said that you could get a visual novel up and running within a few hours, I am talking about RenPy and nothing else. RenPy is the easiest to learn from, and honestly, it's not the most beginner friendly, I would say. Like, you still gotta look up a few YouTube tutorials to get it running, but it is still very approachable for somebody who has no experience coding. The only downside with RenPy is that a lot of its features that help the player, like the back buttons, the pause, getting rid of the text box on the screen, all of those features are automatically coded into RenPy. And because of that, people will probably be able to tell that you used RenPy when you made your game. And also, RenPy is specifically for visual novels. I've only seen people make like Pokemon clones in RenPy. It's possible to do 3D stuff and crazy stuff in RenPy, but it's not really built for that. So if you really just want a classic visual novel, then you go for RenPy. Now, some examples of visual novels made with RenPy include Doki Doki Literature Club, Long Live the Queen, one of my personal favorite older visual novels, and A Date with Death. And RenPy's been around for a long time. A lot of great games. If you look in the visual novel space, a lot of games made with RenPy. I know Long Live the Queen is old now. It's 11 years old. So sad. Next up, we're going to talk about Twine. Somebody else mentioned Twine in the chat, so you were thinking ahead of me. Twine is specifically a browser-based interactive visual novel engine made for interactive nonlinear stories. It runs in browser, you can code it in browser. It's great for approachable and specifically educational spaces. A lot of schools will use Twine actually to help students learn about historical situations and coding and all that good stuff. However, the unfortunate side of this is that it requires a lot of in-depth code to make non-text elements work. So like literally Twine is built just for text. If you only want text, like you're really focusing on the novel part, the visual novel here, when we're talking about Twine. Um, However, what a lot of people recommend doing with Twine is, especially if you've got really branching narratives, then it's really easy to prototype all of your big major plot points and multiple choice branches in Twine, and then export it into a different program. You can put tweaks with basic. Oh, okay. Apparently, Twine does support pictures with HTML. That is good to know. I personally have the slightest experience with Twine. I am putting it here on other people's recommendations. So people speak really well of Twine. Next up, we've got some notable visual novels made with Twine. We've got Wayfarer, we've got Trigea, blue sci-fi, and we've got Golden Threads. So these examples do, of course, have those visuals that I mentioned are a bit more difficult to work with Twine, but it's not impossible, like we've had a few people say. It is not impossible to work visuals into Twine, but since it's built in browser, it's a lot more approachable from the text-based aspect. Will this panel be uploaded? Yes, this panel is currently being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube within a month or so, as will all of the other panels that are being recorded. Next up, we've got RPG Maker. Now, when you're first coming into learning about RPG Maker, you learn about all of the RPG games that are made with it. You learn about RPG horror games, and you learn about all of those fun tile set games, those pixelated games that you can play and have been for, honestly, RPG Maker has been around for a long time. And that's really beneficial in terms of letting in terms of all of the previous people that have worked around with all of the various versions of RPG Maker and have all of that pre-established knowledge to help guide your way. So I recommend RPG Maker, especially if you want to make non-visual novel games and you really love RPGs. It's great for that. And it's not too shabby for visual novels either. When we talk about what version of RPG Maker you want to buy, my recommendation is buying whatever version is on sale. I personally got RPG Maker XP when it was on during a Steam sale that RPG Maker has at least once a year, and I got it for like $4. It retails for around 20 now since it's like a decade old, I think. Oh, never mind. It's only $2 right now. They're having a sale right now. Wonderful. Guys, go download RPG Maker XP. It's great. Somebody in the chat earlier recommended buying MV, which is their most recent, I believe it's their most recent version. MP can retail for around $60 when it's not on sale. So I just recommend keeping up on their Steam page and looking for when they have sales to purchase them. And a lot of the older versions, they have less features, but they do retail for very, very low prices. Some notable games made with RPG Maker include Your Turn to Die, Dead Plate, and To the Moon. So these games really reach the variety of what RPG Maker can make. It can make sort of pure point and click visual novels like Your Turn to Die, and then To the Moon and Dead Plate lean into that pixel aesthetic. So it adds like obviously you can walk around, talk to people, and have all those tile sets ready to go in RPG Maker, and it's a lot easier to do than in other engines. Next up, we've got Game Maker Studio. This game is not just for visual, or this game engine is not just for visual novels. It's a full engine that can help you with 3D and it can help you with full development. It was really up there as a big player with Unity Unreal for a while. However, a lot of the bigger studios have stepped away from Game Maker, but it's still a very good engine when you're exploring. However, like I said in the cons here, it's kind of like using a flamethrower to light a candle if you're just going to use it as a visual novel engine, because there's so much more that it can do. And unless you really have an idea of your visual novel being a little bit out of the box and having a lot of specific programming necessities that the other engines don't work with, then if you have that idea, then I would go for Game Maker Studio. Some notable games made with this engine include Cinders, Undertale, and Valhalla. These two over here, big players in the visual novel RPG scene, and they were made with Game Maker Studio. So this is a very versatile engine, and it's a bit more chunky, but if you really want to dig your teeth into an engine, then this one's a good option. All right, we're done with engines. Now we're going to talk about a more of the visual aspects of this. As a visual artist, I was the lead artist of my game, and I wanted to highlight how you make your game look pretty, you know? All right, we've got 20 minutes, I believe, on the clock. All right. So, where do you find art and where do you find backgrounds specifically? Because our game was holiday themed, specifically Christmas themed, we really needed stock photos. Honestly, we were on a time crunch. We needed to make a game in 2 weeks. That is not enough time to draw and flesh out at least 6 different backgrounds that we needed for our game. So we turned to stock photos. Stock photos are great. You just can throw a filter over them, throw a few lighting adjustment layers, and they look wonderful, especially if they match the aesthetic of the sprites that you've got. I would always recommend if you're using stock photos, make sure they've got a free use license, make sure that you're allowed to use them within your own projects, and yeah, always check the licenses on your stock photos. But I know most people don't like using stock photos within their visual novels, and a lot of people really want to lean into that anime aesthetic that are present in a lot of VNs. Oh, no, we're not done yet. Just throw a blur on a stock photo. Exactly. But if you don't want to go for the stock photo route, where you're going to want to go is you're going to want to go to DL Site, which is one of the main primary sources of generic anime visual novel backgrounds. And there's going to be a lot of resources available if you really want to lean into that anime aesthetic. It helps if you know Japanese. It's not entirely necessary. Um, and I would recommend looking on Itch, looking on Etsy. All of those places that have pre-made art to sell are going to be readily available to you if you just are willing to purchase a few backgrounds for your visual novel. If you need specifically like bedroom setups, then I would recommend looking into VTuber backgrounds. Those tend to have a lot of variety and are also really well made. And however, the big caveat that I have here with anime style backgrounds is that AI is really prevalent on the internet right now when it comes to generated backgrounds. I had a hard time finding an Etsy shop that didn't use AI to make their backgrounds. So I would always recommend double and triple checking your backgrounds if you're pre-purchasing them to make sure that they are made by a real person and not by an AI. Next up, where do you find sprites? If you're not an artist, then sprite making is going to be another main hurdle that you have to get across when it comes to making a classic visual novel. If you're all right with this anime aesthetic that is present in a lot of visual novels, many itch artists and developers have pre-made assets for you to use within your own games. I wanted to highlight Sutemo, who is one of the many creators that basically does pit crews, but for anime style sprites. And speaking of pit crew, if you want to use pit crew, I highly recommend it for prototyping and especially for character design. Pit crews are great for fleshing out character looks and visuals. However, pit crews are made by people passionate in what they do, and you do not want to profit monetarily or even in popularity on a pit crew if they do not give permission for you to use their pit crews within your own projects. So again, just like the stock photos, please make sure that when you're using pit crews that you have the permission of the original artist, and that especially if you're using it for commercial use, that you got their permission and you got all the rights ready to go for it. Customizable VTubers are very common. Yes, and that will really help you if you want to do Live 2D in your visual novels. So here is a slide that I just wanted to throw in as sort of my process on working on the sprites that I had in our visual novel, Christmas Messenger. This right here is the main love interest in the game, and like I mentioned earlier, this was a fan game, so here's what he looked like in his original game. So one of the challenges that I had in translating this 3D model into sprites is that I had to make all the effects that are present in the 3D model. I had to do all the patterns and all the detailing and all that fun stuff. But really getting sprites down is important because sprites are going to be the most commonly seen thing in your visual novel. The backgrounds are, of course, in the background, and they're not the visual focus of the scene, but the characters are going to be the most important aspect of how your visual novels present themselves to the audience. And CGs are also important, but again, sprites are going to be seen again and again. So this is going to be something that you really want polished. If you want the visuals of your visual novel to really stand out. Yes, background artists are I highly commend anybody who's a background artist. We just got stock photos. Guys, backgrounds are so hard to make. Give a shout out to your local background artist. I think they need it for the long hours that they put into making their art. And one of the key factors when it comes to sprite work is going to be in facial expressions. A lot of visual novels will do this technique where they have a singular sprite that they change the face of or change a specific aspect of in order to make it seem like there's multiple sprites within the game. So one of the main ways that I did this with Christmas Messenger was that I divided up the face into three distinct parts, or two if you don't want to count the glasses. So it was the base face, the layer below all of the facial features, and then it were the eyes and the eyebrows, and then the nose and the mouth. Now, studios might even go further to separate the eyes from the eyebrows and the nose from the mouth, but this allows you. So, for example, this sprite that I made was just one piece of art. And then I drew different faces to put on top of on top of that singular sprite. And that allowed me to make multiple expressions with essentially the same artwork. It's significantly less challenging to redraw the mouth than it is to redraw the entire face. And of course, if you have different assets like surrounding your character's face, for example, you want it to be covered in shadow, or your character has glasses, then those are also good to separate when you're making the artwork. And because of that expression variety that I had, it allowed me to explore the visuals of the sprite without having to do significantly much more work. And it can lead to some fun combinations. For example, I had sort of a bashful eye type and a smile. But what happens when you combine the bashful eyes with the frown? So the second example on the right kind of looks more of like a pouty sad expression when what I was going for was sort of like a blushy expression. I've got one question. For both background art and sprites, would it be known ahead of time how many sprites / backgrounds you need for the final game, or would you add as time goes on? If you're good at planning, then you should know beforehand. I don't mean this to be condescending. I mean, when we made our game, we didn't know how many backgrounds we would need, and last minute we were like scrambling to find like a street background, for example. Like we forgot that we had a scene set in the middle of the street, and we were like, "Oh God, we don't have a background for the street, right?" So so hopefully you will want to know before you start what you need. But if things unexpectedly pop up, that's perfectly fine. But again, that leans into feature creep. Like you want to keep it as minimal as possible to get the point across, if that makes sense. Are my expression pieces layered in the game engine or did I create them separately? Some people will layer them in engine. A lot of games do this, where they have each of the sprites layered individually within the engine itself. I did not do that. but I exported all of the sprites individually with every single different expression as its own image. So then I think, okay, let me think. This character, the love interest in Christmas Messenger, had around 26 separate image files exported into the game to get every single expression variety. If you think about there's three mouths and three eyes, then 3 times 3, it's at least 9 expressions. I might be doing my math wrong. Guys, I'm not a math major. But it, like I said, like if you think about it, I only had to draw basically one sprite. But I got around 20 expressions through just changing the eyes and the mouth, all on the same sprite. Oh, we've got people advertising themselves as background artists. Honestly, good for you. Get that bank. We love background artists. Oh, no. Somebody mentioned this earlier. Now we're going to talk about live 2D in visual novels. This is something that is very niche right now, and isn't explored very much in the scene, specifically because live 2D is so hard to get right. I have attempted to make a VTuber model before, and it's so difficult. Basically, if you think about the skill that goes into making art, you have to multiply it by at least 5 to get the level of live 2D. Yes, guys, I love Pyre Waltz. They're up on YouTube. Their visual novel's currently in development. But it looks so good. That art is so beautiful, and it's all in live 2D. Imagine having to rig 4 arms, guys. That's crazy. Um, Again, if you're a beginner, specifically if you're a beginner on the art side, I don't recommend animating your sprites. However, it can really make a visual novel stand out. It is gaining momentum, there's a lot of resources around it. However, it is a labor of love and much more intensive than just making regular sprites. But if you don't want to use live 2D, or if you just want to add a little bit more of visual flair to your video game, then I recommend checking out Visual Novel Design on YouTube. They have a lot of tutorials on what you can do to make sprites stand out more sim simply through composition and depth and lighting and all of those things that basically just add a little bit more of effects work to visual novels. Let's see. How easy do folks feel the Live 2D interface and workflow? How easy is it to get used to? I've used Live 2D before. It's pretty good once you get into the flow of things, but the barrier to entry is much higher for Live 2D. For example, the main program that you're going to want to use for Live 2D, there's like one engine. Oh God, what's it called? There's like one engine that people use to rig for Live 2D, and it is free. However, if you want a complex model, like there's a limit cap on how many layers you can have in it. So the models are very simplified unless you pay a subscription fee for it. So I'm not going to get too in depth on Live 2D. If anybody has any questions about it, though, you can ask me after the panel. I have some experience and I can throw some tutorials your way. It is expensive, so expensive. Yes. Um, but yes, another way to add visuals to your game without live 2D or without strict animation is through position, camera angle, depth of field, all that good stuff. You don't need live 2D to make your game look great, is what I want to say. But it is always good to lean into what you're good at. Another way to add a uniqueness to your game is to add a unique text layout. This can be seen in games such as One Night Stand and 999, where the visual novel aspect is taken on a different level in terms of UI. A lot of games will do this where they have texting on a phone be the way that you talk about, or that you have the text of your video game showing up on the screen. One Night Stand is also great in terms of background and character movement. I highly recommend checking it out if you want that sort of that classic point and click look. I recommend checking out One Night Stand. And lastly, we've got 999, and this game was primarily made for DS systems, which had 2 screens on them. So the way that 999 worked is there would be a bottom layer with a 3D render that you could interact with to solve the puzzles present in the game. It was a very puzzle mystery game. And then the text would show up on the top of the screen with the character sprite. So specifically designing 999 for the DS kind of forced it into creating its own visual style for how it wanted to present its game. So think about what console or what device you want your game to be played on. A lot of people will do this for mobile games, for example. Think about like the dimensions and how you want text to be displayed on the screen. Next, we're going to talk about where you want to publish your game. Now, there are obviously many, many different publishing platforms that you can use. If you're a beginner though, really you're going to be looking at Itch and Steam. Itch is what I highly recommend for first-timers looking to publish their own game because it doesn't have any submission fees and you can make an account on the website very, very easily. However, Steam is going to be the major platform you want to get into when you're really getting serious about publishing because they have a $100-ish submission fee and all submissions get manually reviewed on the site to sort of keep the quality up for all games published on Steam. So if you're going into this without looking for money, then I would recommend Itch as your go-to. Lastly, we're going to talk about what you do after you publish your game. Now, if you have any goals going into this, I would say that my goal when I first published my game was literally just to get it published. Oh, we got a question. If we're making fan games, is it safe to host on Itch? Yes, primarily because Itch allows you to basically a lot of games on Itch are free. So there's no money involved when it comes to Itch. I would not try to publish a fan game on Steam because first off, you have to pay for it and you have to own the licenses for the game on Steam. You do not want to publish a fan game on Steam. On Itch, there are a lot more lax about what you can do and the like what level of license you have over your game. So I'm not gonna say like guys, technically fan games are still illegal. Um, but it's sort of like convention and artist alley selling in the sense that like a big game company isn't gonna like really come after you if you're not making profit off of your game and you're not like advertising it as your own like to a wide public space. Like don't at a company and say that you made a fan game for their game, right? Oh, we've got our 5 minute warning. Wow, time went by so fast, guys. We've got 5 minutes. Oh no. Um, okay, yes. Did you achieve your goal in making your game? If you're just making your game for the first time, I recommend having your goal just be to get your game published. That's my recommendation. Keep it simple. We're here for the fun of it. And really, you just want to take away the skills that you learned from this process and from your journey to really how do I phrase this? Especially if you were working on this game on your own, then you can learn so many things from video game development. Oh, thank you so much. I wish I could go for 2 hours. I don't know if I could talk that long. Um, but again, this is an ever-going journey. You always just want to explore what you want to do in the way that you want to do it. And video game development is such a passionate field, and it's fueled by people who love doing what they do. And yeah, always remember that we're doing this for ourselves and ourselves alone to get our artistic vision out there. Let's talk on money. This is not really going to be a factor for the majority of people who are making visual novels on their own, but I always recommend if you want to make a profit off of this, if you really want to do this as a solo developer and make money eventually, years down the line, you're always going to want to talk to a business advisor, get a lawyer, all that fun stuff. You do not want the IRS coming after you. Okay, so here is where there would have been a demo if we had time. um, I'm just going to shout out. Everybody, please go check out Mistletoe for the Christmas Messenger on itch.io. You can play it in browser. It is a labor of love that I made within 2 weeks. And there's some brilliant art and brilliant work from the rest of my team who helped to make this game a reality. The full game only takes around 30 minutes to complete, so if you want an example of a visual novel made on a time budget, then check it out just for the example of it. One quick question. You want to practice coding? What do you recommend engine-wise or programs specifically for coding? If you want to look into C Sharp, you're going to want to use Unity. HTML you can use in a variety of programs as well. Engines, especially if they're browser-based, are basically always going to use HTML. CSS and JavaScript are great for Twine, and C Sharp is good for Unity, and I think Unreal uses a different one though. It's always good to shop around. And we've got 2 minutes left. If anyone has any last questions, they can ask, but otherwise, we are done with the panel. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. This was a blast. Time went by so fast. I am always going to be available on the Discord if you have any further questions, but otherwise, I hope everybody else has a wonderful day. Please check out the other panels. Can we have a CitrusCon game jam? Ask the organizers. That would be great to happen. Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Bye bye. You have a nice day.